Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are in the midst of the Ukrainian war, and we are going to explore some of the motivations behind Russia's actions and have as our guest is John O'Neill. John is a best-selling author, graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy and served with distinction in Vietnam, a lawyer by training, a graduate of the University of Texas School of Law. He had a clerkship with Chief Justice William Rehnquist at the U.S. Supreme Court, and has been studying the history of both China and Russia in the use of bioweapons. His latest book, The Dancer and the Devil, which he co-authored with Sarah Wynne, is now available on Amazon, and it tracks the history of how Marxism has used bioweapons historically. So, John, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be on your podcast.
Joel, you want to start us off with the first question?
I mean, one of the things that's very interesting is, you talk about the role of Marxist ideology and its interest in bioweapons. But at this stage of the game, would you consider either the Russian regime or even the Chinese regime as Marxist in any real sense anymore, or are they just autocracies?
Well, what they are is sort of failed Marxist states. They have totally centralized authoritarian political control, greater in China than in Russia. But in China, every single business has a party committee. If you start an American business, you have to pay for the party committee to be there. In Russia, there's less control, but there is tight authoritarian control at the top. The ideology for Putin's friends is purely Marxist. Putin says that Stalin and Lenin should be saints, and that Stalin was a great man, the great man of Russia, that he simply on occasion got bad advice. Xi, of course, is still pursuing ultimately a Marxist state. From time to time, he talks about equity and believes that he's almost reaching a stage where all property should be divided. So you have people that are pursuing a Marxist state. It just hasn't been successful in Russia. Of course, that's why the Soviet Union collapsed. In China, as you know, Deng said famously, look, we don't care if it's a red cat or a black cat as long as it can catch mice. And so China, circa 1975, finally pulled itself out of the Maoist period and seemed to be moving forward towards a capitalist democratic state. Unfortunately, at Tiananmen Square, the entire, there was a massacre of students, but the entire leadership of China completely changed. The prime minister of China was in prison. The head of the Communist Party was in prison, and the Maoists took over the party. They've moved more and more, further and further towards radical solutions, never more than since Xi took over in 2013. Xi is definitely an avowed Marxist and a supreme totalitarian.
And how similar in tone or in attitude is Xi together with Putin? Are they cut from the same cloth? Is Putin and his desires in Ukraine mimicking in any way what's going on in China, or are they two separate situations?
Xi says that Putin is his best foreign friend. Putin says Xi is his best friend. They're two sides of the very same penny. They're closely allied militarily now. They have joint military exercises, and you're dealing with two very closely aligned countries. I personally think, although I can't prove it, that the Ukraine-Taiwan deal is a twofer. The idea is that Putin takes the Ukraine, China takes Taiwan, while the West is weak. And I think that's what's underway.
Yeah, I completely, I know other people who echo that, and it seems like a very plausible possibility, which kind of brings us to the question of tactics. So if you look at what Putin is doing today and how he's going about rebuilding the Soviet empire, starting with Ukraine, there's been a lot of talk about war crimes and about massacring people. And in your book, you talk about the history of Russia in mass killings, especially using bioweapons. How likely is it, you think, that bioweapons will be used here? And kind of what's the history of all of this?
Well, here's what's the tremendous miscalculation of the West. You know, we sent a plane or told Zelensky, as you recall, we have a ride, come on, escape. And he said, I don't need a ride, I need bullets. Well, if you understand the history of the Ukraine was the very last place that the Bolsheviks succeeded in conquering around 1923. This was not a light matter to Stalin. In 1931, Stalin began a complete massacre of all the intelligentsia of the Ukraine. And the story of the Kobars is the best of those stories. The Kobars are people in the Ukraine who are like Western singers. They play mandolins. They historically rode around the plains like bards in the Middle Ages, and they told the stories of the Cossacks. And so their music is much like Western music. 1931, Stalin summoned them all to Kiev for a meeting. So initially, it's supposed to be a meeting, and then they were going to go to Moscow to meet with the leadership to sort of get together. Well, the train they climbed on went 14 miles out of town, and then all 368 Kobars were shot in the back of the head. They were buried with their instruments, and the Kobar was banned, and their songs were all banned in the Ukraine on penalty of death. Stalin then collectivized all the farms in the Ukraine. The Ukraine, sort of think about sort of an Iowa, really is what the Ukraine was much like in those days. He collectivized it, took the small farmers. They were all taken away to camps. Many of them were killed, or they were put on projects which resulted in their death. As a result of the collectivization of farms, the amount of grain being produced in the Ukraine went way down, but Stalin still imposed the same quotas. And so he seized all the grain and all the seed grain and produced a famine in the Ukraine that killed somewhere around 6 million people. This was the greatest slaughter in Europe, other than the Holocaust, in modern times. So the Ukrainians remember this. This is very much like your grandfather being killed by someone, and then somebody enslaving you for years. And now you're finally free, and they come back to want to enslave you again. It's doubly so because, as we talk, Putin's grandfather was Stalin's taster. He was Stalin's taster and cook. Putin's father was an exterminator in the Ukraine during World War II. I mean, his job was to follow the Red Army and shoot collaborators in the back of the head. So when Putin talks about, I need to denazify the Ukraine, he's a chip off the old block.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think that Putin's grandfather was the taster for Stalin, and especially when you start thinking about bioweapons and poisoning and things like this. So it sounds to me that the history of using bioweapons, both very tactically to eliminate people, as well as in a broader sense to eliminate peoples, is not something that's new here.
No, Stalin started in 1921 with a poison lab in Moscow, and it was connected by tunnel to Lubyanka, which was the headquarters of the KGB. That was so they could move people over to use them as rabbits, to test new poisons, and then to surreptitiously execute them if they chose to do that. He started off as an individual poisoner, and he poisoned people like the great ballerina Anna Pavlova, Tikhon, the patriarch, the head of the Orthodox Church. He poisoned the head of the KGB, a guy named Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky, who gave a speech against Stalin, and then he died of a heart condition immediately. And around 1928, he decided to move from retail poison into the actual establishment of massive bioweapons facilities. The first of these was at a place called Saratov, west of Moscow, about 60, 70 miles west of Moscow. And that facility is still in use, still producing bioweapons today. The interesting story about Saratov is in 1939, Stalin summoned in the head of Saratov, a guy named Berlin, and had him come to Moscow. Well, he arrived at the Hotel Nacional in Moscow, and he began coughing. They summoned a doctor, and the doctor said, "My God, Berlin, you've got pneumonic plague. We haven't seen pneumonic plague in Moscow in 300 years." And this guy, in the course of weaponizing pneumonic plague, had caught it and unknowingly was about to expose Beria, Stalin, and the leadership of the Soviet Union to it. Of course, they both died. In those days, pneumonic plague without any sort of antibody was inevitably fatal. They closed down the Hotel Nacional, said there was a plumbing failure, and then hid the story for years and years until it finally became known in the 1990s.
Is there any evidence of them using chemical weapons so far in this conflict? We've seen a bunch of assassinations. Is that part of this, or?
Yeah, well, there's no question. The assassinations that have gone on, the Liternoy assassinations, are people who were opposed to Putin's war. That's almost certainly. I mean, I don't believe that 7 people committed suicide chopping up their little kids, but delivers a message to all the people in Russia that you better not oppose Stalin. In terms of the actual use beyond that, the military.
I think you meant Putin, but maybe it's hard to distinguish.
I meant Putin. Please forgive me. They, in many ways, are sort of, in my mind, interchangeable figures after studying them.
Well, and almost genetically related based on some of the history here.
Well, the only possible use of them in this war so far is at Mariupol. Mariupol is the little city holding on in eastern Ukraine. It's held on for 50 some days. Incredible story. It's held by a group called the Marines, the Ukrainian Marines, actually trained with the American Marines, have the same uniform, light green, the same motto, always faithful. And 2,700 of them went to hold a steel plant at Mariupol. They're down to 800 or 900 still alive. They report that they were sprayed with strange chemicals and so on that have caused people to become sick and to die. They're holding on the basement there, along with some civilians too. The Russians have said, no, we're not using banned weapons. We're just using special substances. Now, I'm not sure. I guess if I'm a Marine and I'm sitting in the basement and I'm watching people die all around me, there's not a lot of difference between special substances and chemical or biological weapons, but we haven't gotten to the truth of what that is yet. That's the one instant I'm aware of. Of course, there are incredible war crimes going on in the Ukraine apart from that.
What do you think? I mean, you think about Ukraine. I think of Babi Yar as an example of a Ukrainian-based war crime. What do you think will ultimately happen here?
I think it's one of those things that's yet to be written. I think he went in thinking that he would overwhelm them. I think he didn't understand the nature of warfare. The old idea of the tank column with the planes on top, with things like the Javelin missile, where a guy can sit in a little hole 2.5 miles away and shoot a rocket. The day of the armored column is over. It's over. You know, the deals that conquered Western Europe and the 2 Gulf Wars, that day is gone. He's now moving back to a tactic that he used in Syria, which is to sit with artillery and just turn the cities into ashes and slaughter all the people involved until they've suffered so much that they're either gone or there's no one left. And I really think it depends on how the West supplies the Ukrainians. The weapon that is terrifying to artillery is not other artillery, it's drones. And so if we provide them with Predator and other drones, enough of them, where they're like mosquitoes biting these guys every time they raise their head, then I think the Ukrainians can hold out and perhaps save their country.
The cost of rebuilding, whether Russia ultimately takes over these places or whether or not the Ukrainians are successful in fending them off, the cost of rebuilding is going to be massive. Do you think the will is there on the Allied side to provide the financing for that rebuilding?
I think that they can do a lot of it themselves. You know, it's a rural country. It's a very rich country. It's one of the great suppliers of grain in the entire world. The entire price of grain since this war started, of corn, has gone from $4 a bushel to $8 a bushel. And that's because the Ukrainians, people figured that Ukraine is not going to be able to plant this spring and this summer. In addition, they also have iron ore, they have huge steel plants, they have a fair amount of oil and gas of their own. So it's a pretty rich place. And I think with, you know, kind of, if I can call it seed corn, using an agricultural deal, with some seed corn to get by and enough to live on, I think they can do pretty well on their own if they're left alone. I don't think they count on much charity from the rest of us.
But, you know, I mean, was Putin involved at all when Syria used chemical weapons against its insurgents? Is there some sort of relationship there that we can show that he's willing to do this?
Yes, he's provided chemical weapons over and over again. The Russians provided the chemical weapons that Hussein used early on against the Kurds. They were right out of the Russians had a project called Project Enzon. When the rest of the world declared off of chemical and biological warfare in 1972, the Russians started their largest single project at that instant. The guy who, number 2 guy, defected. His name was Kenneth Albeck, and he wrote a book called Biohazard. And he describes, at one point, the Russians had 62,000 scientists working on their bioweapons facilities. They had an island called, it was an island you'd put animals on, and then they'd bomb it with biological weapons, collect the dead, and then bomb it again. Rebirth Island was the name of it, in the Sea of Azov. And so they've had a major commitment to it. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we provided funds to both the Ukraine and the Soviet Union to get rid of the biolabs, which contain horrible, you know, smallpox doesn't exist anywhere in the world except in the Soviet and Chinese labs and other deals. The Ukrainians used them to purge their labs. They turned their labs from bio-war labs into biolabs, engaged in the production of vaccines and good things. The Russians actually went right back into the bio-war business as soon as Putin took over in 2000. The guy who had been in charge of the cleanup and diverted the money was fired, and then he was placed in charge of the entire pharmaceutical industry of all of Russia, which is the position he now holds right now. So that is amazing. Putin calls it special warfare. Putin says in a nuclear war, if I throw a nuclear bomb your way, you're going to throw one back at me. But if somebody coughs in Kansas, it's a shame that you didn't immunize all your people against smallpox. We did. And that's a shame for you. It doesn't have anything to do with us. And so it's a deniable form of warfare. And that's why Putin loves it and why the Chinese have explored it.
Well,
how do you think the connection is there between
the Chinese connection
and the
Well, early on in the Stalin days, Stalin seeded China with biolabs. Part of the original biolabs came from the Japanese, who ran a terrible biolab in Manchuria using American POWs as test rats. And so the Japanese guys who did that were all shipped to Moscow, and some of them were kept in China. And China went in the bio-war business. Then China had suffered terribly from Japanese bio-war. They lost at least 200,000 dead from the Japanese use of bioweapons. And so China got in the bio-war business, but not as aggressively as Russia. Russia, beginning in 1972, went into bio-war on an unbelievable scale. China likewise was in bio-war. And after roughly 1958, they fell apart, of course, and disliked each other. And some of the best information we have on the Chinese bio-war program comes from Russian intelligence, pre-1990 Russian intelligence. We know in 1984 that the Chinese had a leak in northern China of Mars burgers, which is a terrible disease. and other deals. And then, of course, once they got back together, circa 2010, our information about China from Russia shut off. But in 2005, for example, Russia accused China of having biowar facilities and leaking them in Shanghai.
Wow.
You know, one of the premises of our podcast is that we're in the midst of a reshifting of world order that looks a lot like what it used to look like in the 1600s, right? With
or even
feudal
earlier.
Overlords. How do you
Life is a circle.
how do you see the Ukraine? You posited the notion that the Ukraine is Russia's gift to the world, and taking over Taiwan is China's gift to the world. How do you see the restructuring of the world order coming about as a result of what's happening today?
I think it's hard to predict. I mean, I know that sounds silly. If you looked at it, you'd say it was hopeless. Honestly, you'd look at this tremendous powerhouse China coming on, gangbusters with incredible new military technology. They're talking about putting up missiles, you understand, that never come down. They say there's going to be a Chinese sky and that the Pacific is the Chinese lake, that we just better get used to it. And the Russians likewise are now, really a wonderful country, but now ruled by a guy who's it's like a terrible clone from the past coming. There are signs of hope. First, in Russia, Putin is not popular in Russia. That's all a gift. If they could, the reason Putin sits at that end of that table is he knows what happened to Stalin in 1953 when Stalin himself was poisoned after planning a nuclear war and other purges, as related in the book, The Dancer and the Devil. In China, there's a lot of opposition to Xi. It just can't be public, because if it is public, you disappear and they harvest your kidneys and life moves on.
Now, by the way, I just, in a shameless plug for your book, I just shared my screen and put up the picture of your book and the cover, and I thought it'd be useful for people to take a quick look. Okay, I'm going to take it off now, and we'll get back to the discussion. Go ahead.
There are a lot of pictures relevant to the book at the website, thedanceranddevil.com, that are, can't be in the book because they're much greater than the amount of the book. But what do I think will happen? I'm given to think this may sound, I was trying to figure out in the book a way to end the book happily, right? Because the world is a grim place.
And everybody needs a Hollywood ending.
Right.
Well, Gandhi said, look, don't despair. He said, these tyrants, take a look at history. They always fall. Their statues always roll in the dirt. And thinking of Stalin, of course, that's exactly right. Stalin was put on ice next to Lenin. And then in 1961, they pulled him out and buried him and threw him away and so on. So there is always hope. And in 384, roughly 384, when Attila the Hun was conquering all of Europe, he burned the city of Reims in France, and the Archbishop at Reims gave a talk, one of the few that survives from, the Roman Empire times, and there were people dead all around. And he sat there and he said, look, see all these people? They're the stars that lead us to the future. And don't look at the dirt, look at the horizon, because there are many miracles between us and the horizon. And that's what I believe. I'm an optimist, even in the face of these two terrible guys.
So as we get to the the end of the interview, I'm wondering, what can we do in America, and what can the West do, and how important is our response, or are we just going to allow this kind of behavior to go on? And obviously, I assume that, for instance, that Putin was encouraged by the success in Syria. What can the West do? It seems to me, I know you're probably more on the right than either of us, but it seems to me that a large part of the Republican Party is quasi-sympathetic to Putin. What can we in the West do to combat something like this? Because this is really quite frightening, because it's the chemical weapons and the biological weapons. Once they're unleashed, there's nothing much you can do about it.
Well, this is going to sound stupid, but the first thing to do is to actually deal with the truth. My dad described before Pearl Harbor how they used to beg people, God, the Nazis are coming. They're terrible people, and no one would listen. And literally, as the bombers went overhead, people were surfing at Malibu. I mean, at Waikiki in Hawaii, and we lost part of the Pacific Fleet because we couldn't confront the truth. I think we really need to confront the truth. COVID is a manufactured virus. It came from a Chinese military lab. Playing with bioweapons is a terrible game. It threatens mankind. It's a horrible, horrible thing to do. Xi is a horrible tyrant. There's sympathy among some people for Xi in China. That's a terrible tyranny. He's purged over 100,000 people from the Communist Party itself and killed them in the last 9 years. He's an absolute tyrant. Likewise, Putin is an incredible tyrant. So start with the truth that those are the people we're actually dealing with, not as a matter of politics, not Republicans or Democrats, but sort of as human beings. These are two people that are threatening the whole world in its own way. And once we actually acknowledge the truth, there are many things. We have to be prepared for biowar. We don't have any vaccines. It would take us 2 years to get enough vaccines to vaccinate people from smallpox. Well, we know smallpox exists in these laboratories. Why on earth don't we have vaccines prepared in advance for smallpox? Why aren't we shining the light of history on those biolabs? Why aren't we telling people the truth about them? Having done all that, that's a big start, on trying to deal with these people. I personally think we should be favoring the forces of democracy in Russia and in China, wherever they surface. China is, the guy who just won the Nobel Prize in China in 2012 has died in prison in China. A guy named Liu died in prison because he had cancer and they wouldn't give him any treatment. Well, where are all the news stories about his death in China? The head of the early rain church, a guy named who went to the White House, a guy named Wang, his entire church with 82 people in it were all seized. He's in prison. All the people in the church have disappeared. Their organs have probably been harvested now. I mean, what on earth are these? Is that the sort of government we really want to be involved with? And worse in Putin.
Well, it seems to me that seem to be two areas, where Putin and Xi gain support. One is on the far right in the United States, who see him as some sort of, Christian nationalist, whatever you want to call it, sort of figurehead like a Marie Le Pen. But the other part is all the corporations, including Hollywood and the high-tech guys who are all in bed with China. And,
It's a world.
and so I don't know how, as a country, we rediscover the fact that these are people that we really don't want to be in bed with.
Yeah, Putin's a Christian, okay? He says that Lenin and Stalin should be saints of the Christian church. They killed 127,000 Orthodox priests in a 2-year period. Stalin is famous for pledging that by 1935, the word God would no longer be used in the Soviet Union. And if it was used, it would be a capital offense in Russia to even use the word God. That's Stalin, that's Putin. And if we turn to Xi is, if anything, much worse. The same greed among American corporations we really saw in the 1930s. Remember, we were lending money to Hitler. We were playing footsie with Hitler, always pretending that, in the words of Chamberlain, that Czechoslovakia is a little country far away and we don't know the people there very well. But you see, it always comes home. That's the nature of life. That old poem, "For whom the bell tolls," is really true.
Well, and I presume, John, that to some degree, Xi and Putin are counting on the laissez-faire disinterest of the American public to be able to perpetuate this. Is that valid? Is that a valid assumption or not?
Oh, more than that. She has over 200,000 people whose full-time job is influencers on the internet. When you're talking to George Smith, you may well be talking to somebody in Shanghai. When we published our book, we took the book to publishers in New York, ultimately got it published. But the initial publisher we took it to said, we love the book and we'll publish it if you'll take the part about China out of the book. When we wrote the book, my co-author, my wish was here to tell the story, Sarah Wynn, had the entire manuscript. All of a sudden, the manuscript disappears from the computer. So we go to the FBI, we hire, they say, get a forensic expert, we hire them, and somebody's come down out of the cloud and wiped out the entire book.
Wow.
You want to guess who that is?
Yeah, I can just imagine.
It's Disney, Walt Disney.
Well, hopefully it looked like you had a backup, which
Oh, we did. We had backups, and so it made no difference to us. But no, they exercise tremendous influence in the United States, and the Chinese do. And Putin has any number of apologists. It's disgusting, the apologists for Putin. Some of them apologize on the theory, wait, it's a little country far away. Okay, you can argue that, but anybody who thinks that Putin is a Christian has just not read a book. He deceived Solzhenitsyn early on. He understand he originally was a reformer, claimed to be, and they asked, his mentor was a guy named Slavchek, who was the mayor of St. Petersburg, and who really was a reformer, Russia's greatest reformer. And so when Slavchek, when Putin was elected as prime minister, they asked Slavchek, who is Putin? Who is Putin? And you know what he said? He said, the truth is Putin is the new Stalin. 2 days later, Slavchek and both of his bodyguards had heart attacks and Slavchek died. And that's what actually happened in 2001. And then Putin insisted on giving a eulogy for Slavchek.
Wow, the strategic use of bioweapons for assassination. This is we're going to need to stop because we've run out of time. But John O'Neill, thank you so much again. The book is The Dancer and the Devil. I recommend it highly. Very, very interesting in terms of looking at the history of the use of bioweapons, both in the Soviet Union, in Russia today, and in China. John, thank you for being with us.
It is classic neo-feudalism. It really is. When I heard you mention the term, I thought instantly to how these guys were operating their countries, and you've hit it. That's exactly what it is.
Well, to me, it's very reminiscent of what we saw, in the Middle and Dark Ages. It's the same
thing.
The battles between extremely powerful people with no constraints.
Right.
Exactly.
Thank you again.
Thank you all.
Okay. Thank you.
I love doing it with you guys. Thank you all.
Thank you.